Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hey everyone, it's Susan Kaufman, and you are listening to Attitude Magazine's ADHD Experts Audio. And we welcome back today Ann Dolin, educational expert who has spoken pretty much every summer for Attitude on various topics. All of our children, especially those with learning and attention challenges, deserve a summer break from the grind of homework and quizzes and schedules, and parents deserve a break too. But the facts are that a summer without learning leads to lost skills and forgotten facts and a pretty frustrating step backwards for kids who worked really hard all year long. So in today's talk, Ann Dolin will tell us why that learning is so critical to maintain over the summer and describe ways to keep your kids' minds sharp, especially during vacation days. Some of the things she'll be talking about are hands-on projects that engage kids' minds, how to get reluctant readers excited about books. I know that's a topic that everyone is interested in, and strategies for tackling the summer assignments that a lot of kids have. She'll also recommend resources and books for all ages. Ann's a MED and the owner of Educational Connections in the Washington, D.C. region. With over 20 years of teaching, tutoring, and consulting experience, she's worked with over 8,000 students in her career. Her first book, Homework Made Simple, won the Publishers Association 2011 Parenting Book of the Year Award, and it's a great book, which I recommend to all of you. For more information, visit Ann's website, www.annDolin.com. And thank you so much for joining us today. We're always grateful to have you. Let me give a nod to the sponsor of today's webinar. It's Brili, B-R-I-L-I. Brili is an interactive device and a system to help manage schedules. So it helps make mornings, bedtimes, and other challenging times of the day simple for parents and fun for kids, and leads definitely to less stress for families. Everyone knows that structure and consistency set kids up for success, and Brili is all about helping make that easy. Try Brili now by visiting their website, www.brili.co, Brili.co. So thank you, Brili, for helping us make this webinar available to everyone. So thank you, everyone, and let me turn it over to Ann with our thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you, Susan. It's great to be a part of Attitude webinar series. So let's get started. Let me go back a second and talk about why summer learning is so important for kids. Well, research shows that kids lose ground over the summer. They lose about 2.5 months of progress in both math and reading. So it's significant. We really want our kids to be engaged in some academic work over the summer, but we need to find that balance. Well, what happens when kids don't engage? You know, when they take tests in the fall, we see a slide, and that's what we want to prevent. We know that when kids read at least 4 books over the summer, they actually completely prevent that reading loss in reading. They do better in fall reading tests, and they have better overall first quarter grades. So I see summer learning as falling into 2 buckets. One is assigned. You know, in many schools, kids will have a reading list, and they'll be expected to choose a book or 2 and read those books. Or they may be given a math packet to complete over the summer. They could have to write an essay or keep a journal based on the book they've read. But there's also parent-assigned work. And if you have a younger child, there may not be anything assigned. Or if your child is, say, middle school and the school doesn't provide anything to do over the summer, you may want to get involved and still have your child engaged in learning. Well, let's start off by talking about the assigned work that kids get. You know, we get so many calls in August from parents really stressed out. They'll call our tutoring agency and they'll say things like, oh my gosh, my child had to read Catcher in the Rye and it's due in a week and he hasn't even started it. I'm so frustrated. Or my daughter hasn't even touched her math packet and it's due at the start of school. So it's a great idea now to sit down with your child and figure out what is due. You might even open up the dialogue by saying something like, let's take a look at what you have assigned, and then asking, when is it due, and how can it be broken down? Always get your child's input. It's really ideal to hear what your child says about it, because most kids, especially kids with ADHD, don't like to be told what to do. So anytime you can elicit their feedback, it definitely goes better. So figure out how they can take that book that has to be read by the end of the summer and break it down into parts throughout the summer so it's not all done at the last minute. And develop a routine. I've found in the summer most kids get their best work done in the morning if that's at all possible. Although it's not the same with every kid, especially as children get older, they want to sleep later. But the idea is to tie what you want your child to do to something they already do. For example, if your child has soccer practice Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you can tie getting that math packet done or a couple of pages each time to right after soccer practice. It's much easier for kids to get work done when it's right after or right before something that they already have to do. For example, if you have a family dinner, always on Sundays and sometimes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, that would be a good idea to have that math packet or the book follow that. But sometimes kids need more than just a routine. A lot of times younger kids do well with a written agreement or some type of simple checklist. So let's say that you want your child to do 10 problems in math on a daily basis. Well, for getting those 10 problems done, your child could earn 30 minutes of screen time. For reading, maybe you want your child to read a chapter, or they've agreed upon a chapter. Then they can earn 30 minutes of screen time. And if you want to see proof, especially in that math, have them show it to you when they're done, and that also earns another 15 minutes of screen time. So a simple checklist like this can make a big difference and provide a lot more accountability for students. Oftentimes when we ask kids to do things that are kind of long-term, it's really hard for them. And I found that many students are okay with daily work. If they know something's due the next day, they can generally get it done the day before. But anytime there's something longer term, like an essay that's due in 2 weeks or a science project or a book report, it's very, very difficult for them because they don't have planning skills to think ahead. And if you think about it, time is very ambiguous. It's something that kids don't quite understand. And it's especially difficult for kids with ADHD. So for younger students, I love the idea of making time that's kind of, this nebula almost, something that is really difficult for kids, and making it very, very concrete and at their level. So one idea, let's say your child has to finish a book report by the end of the summer, is say to your child, okay, what are the 4 things you need to do to get this book report done? And your child might say, well, I have to, and then I have to fill out this worksheet my teacher gave me, and then I have to write a rough draft and type the final copy. And you might say, okay, great. So those are the 4 things. I'm going to take this stack of baseball cards and I'm going to break it down into 4 little mini piles. And when you get the first thing done, I'm going to give you that first little stack of cards. Same with the Snickers bar. I'm going to break the Snickers bar into 4 pieces. And when you get each task done, you get a piece of the Snickers bar. And it's just a fun way to make something more concrete, especially when it comes to time. So let's talk a little bit about reading, because I know parents often have questions about, well, what books should my child be reading? And how do I get my child to read in the first place? Younger kids really, I've found, like the Stick Dog series. It's all about a dog, and then there's another one called Stick Cat. These are graphic novels. Also, Henry Winkler, who we all know as the Fonz, wrote Here's Hank, and this is another graphic novel series that kids are really liking. Middle schoolers, there are a number of them, from Hook's Revenge to Chasing Brooklyn to Pop. These are all really great books for reluctant readers. And then in high school, Promposal, Awkward, and Swagger are very popular with kids. Let your child pick the book he wants to read. It's very natural for kids to look at the reading list. I know my son did that this summer, and he asked me which book has the fewest pages. And it's okay to let them pick the one with the fewest pages, but maybe help them pick a couple and let them figure out which one might catch their interest the most. Sometimes once you pick a book, it's hard to get your child started. And it's very common for parents to say things like, go up to your room and read. But that often doesn't work very well. Sometimes as parents, we may go up to our kids' rooms after a half hour expecting them to be reading on their bed peacefully, and they're playing with Legos on the floor. So many kids need a parent involved, at least to get started. So you might say, you know what, I'll read a page, then you read a page. Or for a very reluctant reader, I'll read 2 pages and you read 1 page. It's important not to get overly involved while reading. And what I mean by that is sometimes we've all heard that, oh, ask lots of comprehension questions to make sure your child really understands the book. Ask what will happen next to try to get them to think ahead. But sometimes if you're too verbose while reading, it kind of turns kids off, because in their mind, they want to read to understand, but they really want to get done. So ask questions every now and then if it's appropriate, and definitely ask for a recap at the end of the chapter, but you don't need to be engaging in dialogue at each page. And the same with correcting for miscues. If your child miscues on a word and that completely affects the comprehension and that word really changes meaning, then you can correct your child. But in general, you really don't want to be correcting your child every time he or she makes a mistake, because it does turn kids off from reading. Really, we want them to think of reading as a fun experience, and we don't want kids to feel judged. Other families have found great success with a family book club, and this is something that you might do a couple times a week. And again, tie this to an activity that you already have. So let's say you have family dinners Tuesdays and Sundays. Have a family book club those evenings, and that means turn all electronics off, and everybody in the family is in and on the act of reading, even for a short time, say 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And your child can read the book they've been assigned, or if they're in between books, they can read the sports page, a magazine. The idea is that reading is done by everyone in the family. I have a lot of articles for parents if you're interested in learning more about reluctant readers, and you can see those on my website at ectutoring.com/reluctant-reader 2016. Digital reading can also be a good idea, but you kind of have to be careful. I've found that when kids have access to iPods and Kindle Fires, they often drift when they should be reading. And before you know it, they're watching an hour of YouTube videos, or they're playing Minecraft or online, or they're doing something outside of reading. And for that reason, I found the Kindle Paperwhite to be really helpful. And this is just a basic reader, nothing more. So kids can't get on the internet. There are far fewer distractions. When using a digital reader, also consider font size. There have been a number of studies looking at students with learning disabilities, language-based learning disabilities such as dyslexia, and they found that font size really does matter. So you can ask your child to experiment with making the font a little bit bigger to see if it makes it easier for your child to read. Also, there have been some studies looking at Audible books and their role in helping kids be better readers. And one study found that when kids that want to read a book just above their reading level read the book, I should say listen to the book in the Audible version, but also follow along the text in the hard copy while they're reading, those kids improve their comprehension and fluency better than the kids that just read the book alone. So hearing a good reader read the book and following along is really powerful when it comes to improving reading and comprehension and fluency. Here are a couple of other good ideas for online programs. Let's say your child is reading or they're in between books, or they really won't even pick up a book. What can you do? Here are a couple of good ideas for younger students. I really like K5 reading. This website is for kids from kindergarten through 5th grade, and they do all kinds of interactive games that revolve around reading. I also like Study Dog for younger students. This is a really fun interactive reading program where kids read different books. They're very, very short and answer questions, and they earn prizes along the way. For kids that are that age or even a little bit older, I really like the way the Scholastic Summer Reading Challenge allows kids to document the books they're reading and then log in the time that they're reading. It's all online, and what's neat about it is that kids can win prizes as they go, But if they read certain books, they can also connect with the authors online, and they can be a part of a webcast. They can write back and forth with the author. There's lots of reading activities for kids to do on this website, and I love it. It's a great opportunity for those reluctant readers to get really engaged. And then, of course, we have the good old-fashioned book clubs and incentive programs that public libraries run, and also Barnes & Noble and the few bookstores that are left now. But these are also great ideas where kids can get a reading chart and also log how much they're reading. And if you do sign your child up for one of these programs, I would also look for one that has a discussion group attached to it. I've found that these are really helpful for kids because if they know that, say, at the end of July, they're meeting with their discussion group to talk about a particular book, they're far more accountable to somebody else and they're much more likely to actually do the reading. And it also gets them engaged in dialogue, which is something that they're going to have to do as they get older, kind of like the Socratic seminar model. For older kids, I like the website called readstoried.com. And I like it because it contains a lot of vocabulary development activities. And that's important for students that are in high school because eventually they're going to have to take either the SAT or ACT. And improving vocabulary is really important. And it's especially important for kids that do not like to read because the way you improve your vocabulary the most is actually by reading. So this kind of combines reading in a fun way. It's really interactive and practicing vocabulary at the same time. Well, let's talk a little bit about writing. You know, kids with ADHD are often so smart, and they can tell you a story a mile long. But when it comes to writing down their ideas, forget it. They're not engaged, they don't want to do it, and they don't see the purpose. When I was a teacher, I was both a special education and a general ed teacher. I found that many of my students were really adverse to writing, especially boys. And I found that using a dialogue journal with them made a huge difference. And you can do this with your kids too. In the dialogue journal, you basically ask a question. You pose a question to your child. What you don't want to say is, how was your day? Or what's your favorite sport? Something like that. Those questions are kind of a little bit overwhelming to kids because they have to really think and process their answer. It's better to start out by asking them more succinct questions. So, for example, if your child played in a soccer game yesterday and you noticed that she made a great pass, you might say, how did you know to pass it to your left winger at that time? And so when you ask a specific question, kids are more likely to write back. And then once you see the response the next day, you write back on your own time and then leave it for your child to respond that evening. Be careful not to correct your child's grammar or spelling. And I know this is very, very hard for us as parents because many of us want it to be just right. But at the end of the day, all we want to do is to have our kids engage in the writing process. And again, if they feel judged, kind of like reading, they're less likely to do it. Also, a scrapbook is a great way for kids to journal what happened over the summer. And they only need to write captions, so writing is minimal. You can look at a bunch of other articles we have on the same topic at ectutoring.com/summer-writing for other ideas on how to get your child to write over the summer. If you have a son who loves sports, I love the Through the Mail program. And the website is cardboardconnection.com. It's really great because kids can write to their favorite athlete in exchange for autographs. And often when they know they're getting something from it, they're much more likely to engage. Let's talk a little bit about math. You know, in the summer, we have this opportunity for our kids to practice skills that they may not do otherwise. I found with a lot of kids with ADHD, they can solve deeper problems, but they don't always have automaticity in their facts like multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. And that ultimately ends up slowing them down. So you could consider having your child work on a website that's really fun for them. They hardly know they're reading or learning, such as funbrain.com, multiplication.com, or mathplayground.com. Now consider setting the timer for, say, 8 minutes, or have an agreement with your child. Don't mandate a certain time. Have a compromise and see what will work for both of you. I like using a strange number, not just 10 or 15, but sometimes if it's 9 or 7, it's a little bit more interesting. And try using a timer at the same time. I love the time timer because you see a red disc disappearing. And for younger students that don't have a sense of elapsed time, I love the time timer. I actually use it for kids that are older too. And in fact, when we give a lot of practice SAT and ACT tests to our high school students and we let them pick the type of timer they use, they pretty much always pick the time timer. So it's a great device for older kids too. And speaking of those students, if you have a child going to a more complicated math, such as algebra, I really like the McGraw-Hill math series. They have them for every grade, and it's a good way to get your child thinking about math again over the summer. So there are also other ways parents can integrate math into the daily routine. I love the idea of a lemonade stand, and kids, for years and years, kids have wanted to earn money, and many times you'll see kids on the side of the road with a lemonade stand, and it's a great idea, but oftentimes kids just want to count the money and they don't think about the expenses involved. So consider a lemonade stand for your child if they want to do that, but have them also think about the expenses. How much is it for that poster board to make the sign? Well, what are you spending on that powder? And how about the cups? Figuring those expenses minus the profit is a valuable lesson for kids. Engage them in cooking. Fractions, decimals, and percents are really the foundation of math, especially as kids get older. And if they're shaky in any one of these three things, they tend to have difficulty when they go into middle school. So engaging them in measuring during cooking is really, really helpful. You can also practice these skills with even finding the sales tax at the mall or the grocery store. I remember a couple of years ago for my kids, the entire summer, I made them figure out the tip every time we went out to eat. And that was really a great lesson for them. Other ideas for integrating math and critical thinking include family game nights. And this is a great idea to get your kids in on the actual activity of planning. So this is when one night of the week you make it family game night and your child gets to pick the game, and maybe they get to pick make their favorite dessert and perhaps pick the background music, but it's really their deal. And during this time, the whole family gets in on playing a board game, or even if it's just you and your child, it doesn't really matter. But the idea is to practice analysis and critical thinking through board games. I really like our good old-fashioned favorites like Scrabble and Monopoly, Payday. But there's also another game, especially if you want your child to practice math, called Challenge 24. And it's been used in schools throughout the country for many years. It's basically a card game that allows kids to practice multiplication, division, fractions, decimals, and addition and subtraction, but it varies in level. So even younger students in lower elementary school can play it along with up to the end of middle school and beginning of high school. All right, so lastly, I just wanted to mention, you may feel that you want to help your child, but you're getting a lot of pushback from your student. And if you have specific questions about that, I'm happy to answer them in our Q&A in just a few minutes. But sometimes parents feel that they can't go it alone and they want to hire a tutor or a coach to help make sure their child gets through any assigned work, or if there is no assigned work, practices their skills throughout the summer. And I love the idea of the tutor because it kind of takes the onus off of the parent. And sometimes as parents, we feel that we don't want to be the teacher. We're tired of being the homework police during the year, and we don't want this role in the summer. And that's when an objective person comes in. And often this person can get your child to do a lot of things that you might not be able to get your child to do just because they're not mom or dad. I have a tutor for my younger son who has pretty significant ADHD, and it works out great. And she has a 10-10-5-5 system going with him. And that means on the weeks that he's home and not at camp or on vacation, He is to read 10 pages in his book and do 10 math problems. And when he's on vacation, he does 5 pages in his book and 5 math problems. And then when he's in camp, he doesn't do any of them, anything. And it's worked out really well because it's coming from her. I also think it's really helpful when tutors provide more accountability, because sometimes tutors can assign work to your child, but then they go the following week and nothing's been done. And when that happens, it's important that your tutor engage in a check-in, and this can be through FaceTime or Skype, any online system where they can see face-to-face. It could even be a phone call. But basically, the reason FaceTime is so valuable is because the tutor can say, all right, I'm going to check in with you on Thursdays. I want you to show me your math. Be sure you can hold up your paper and show me that it's completed. And that often provides more accountability to the student. All right, so what questions do you have for me?
A couple of questions here. Nancy asks, what are your thoughts on ADD coaches? And the background here is that her child needs lots of help with executive functioning in middle school, keeping track of assignments, reading, follow instructions, and she feels like it's rather than a tutor, her child actually needs some sort of organizational help. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that kind of help over the summer?
I think it's incredibly valuable. In fact, that's about 40% of our business is providing. We call it educational coaching, because these are the soft skills that kids don't really learn in school. And teachers expect kids to be kind of naturally organized and to be able to plan ahead. But the fact is, our kids aren't there yet. And having a coach can be extremely valuable. But I've found that for executive functioning issues, like, for example, we specifically help kids with organization, time management, which includes daily prioritization and long-term planning, and then also study skills. That type of work is generally best done in the school year. And the reason is that many times when kids are required to practice organization in the summer, it's not within the context of school, so they don't always see the reason behind it, or they're teaching skills on planning ahead. But if you don't have any schoolwork, unless it's assignments that you've been giving over the summer, sometimes kids don't buy into it. So if your child has a lot of summer assignments, definitely an executive function and educational coach over the summer is a good idea. But if it's just to practice the skills in isolation, I wouldn't recommend it. I'd say that that's better saved for the school year, because then it can be practiced within the context of their schoolwork. For example, if they have an essay due in 2 weeks, that's a time you can practice planning ahead, breaking down things into smaller bits and recording those little bits into your calendar. So that's best done in the school year.
One person asked about tutoring in the summer specifically. I guess I'd also like to ask the question for the school year. And the question is, how frequently does it make sense to have a tutor? Either for the summer or during the school year, I would ask.
It really depends on the needs of your child. So oftentimes parents will call our office and they'll say, I'd like to have a tutor once a week in the summer. But it's hard to make that work. Of course, we'll set that up, but I've found that between parents' summer vacations and tutors, sometimes that weekly schedule ends up being maybe only 4 or 5 sessions. And so it's better to consider, okay, how many sessions do I want to have over the summer? And then break those down into something maybe a couple times a week while you're in town. But usually I'd say for most kids, a couple of sessions isn't really going to do the trick. About 10 sessions is a better amount over the summer. In the school year, however, it's a little bit different, because it depends on how impacted your student is. If in general your student is able to keep up with homework, then maybe somebody once a week to help with the bigger things like long-term assignments, planning, reducing procrastination, those types of things, that can be done once a week. But if your child is having difficulties also staying on top of the schoolwork, probably at least a couple times a week is a better cycle. Personally, I found that when kids start out with a lot of support, and then they start to do well and you pull back, that's a far better approach than not starting with any or not enough and then realizing after the first quarter, oh no, this isn't going well. Let me jump in and try to fix this. By that point, your child's already feeling bad about school and they're kind of digging out of a hole. So anytime you can be more proactive, you're setting your child up for greater success at the beginning of the year.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Which leads me to a question that I think is interesting, kind of related to that. And a person is asking about your opinion of Khan Academy for math. Mm-hmm. And I guess what strikes me about that question is, would your child be better off with someone, a tutor or someone to support his use of Khan Academy resources? Or is that something that a child could really be expected to do on his or her own?
Mm-hmm. If you can get your child to do it on his own or her own, then go for it. It's probably going to work out well. But if you find that you're fighting the battle to get your child to even log on, then it may not be the ideal solution. I actually like Khan Academy a lot because, instead of just lots of practice problems, it actually shows your child how to work through the problems. But I've found that with kids with ADHD, sometimes they disengage. And if they do, they're kind of lost and they're not as interested. So it could be that Khan Academy is a supplement and not necessarily the main form of instruction.
That makes sense. On this point of disengaging, Wendy asks, and I think this is a question that we hear frequently, what are strategies for a resistant child? I mean, who just doesn't want to do any work at all? Mm-hmm. Should pool time or screen time be restricted until the work is done? Should someone else ask, should phones and devices be pulled? And I think everybody says they just don't want to spend the summer fighting. So, what are ways to cope with the resistant child?
I think the first step is to really open up the dialogue with your child, depending on their age. If you're talking about a first grader, they don't have the cognitive skills to engage in this kind of dialogue. So I'm talking about kids that are a little bit older, maybe middle elementary, upper elementary, and up from there. But you might start with something like, I need your help with this. I know that this has to be done by the end of school, by the end of the summer, but I can tell that you really don't want to do it. How can we come to a compromise so that I'm not nagging you all the time? And just treating your child like an adult, and I know they don't act like an adult, but sometimes opening the dialogue like you're talking to an adult will elicit an adult-like conversation, because oftentimes kids will come up with ideas if you talk to them about it. And I would try that approach before going to restricting everything. In general, though, kids do better in the morning than they do later in the day, and they do better if something is a reward. So, for example, if your child is really, really into Minecraft and you've had it with that game and you feel like, they're really a little bit too engaged in that game, then you can say, when this is done and I've seen it, then you can have Minecraft. But anything that your child really, really loves to do, you can maybe save that for later if that feels like a good agreement with your child. But I would first start by opening up the dialogue with your student before just coming down with the hammer, because they're going to be more willing to follow your lead if they have a part of it.
I loved your idea about associating summer work with other activities, sort of making a schedule where I think you said, whenever we do X, we're also then going to do the reading or the activity, the learning activity. Do you think that scheduling is important in summers can be so unscheduled and free form?
Well, you can usually find something during the week that you always do. Like you always have breakfast, or you always have dinner, or you have soccer on Wednesdays and Thursdays, or you go to your dad's house on these days. There's always some type of routine in a child's schedule. So I would say to dig deep and find where that routine already exists, and then tie what you want your child to do to that. That way, it's more like autopilot. You're not always having to say, oh, you didn't do X today, or did you do your reading? Did you work on your math? But it's kind of tied to something, and you don't have to think about it as much. I would also post that in a public place. For example, if you're going to do game night on Friday night or whatever you decide, make sure you put any agreed upon routine up on the refrigerator or wherever is a public place, so it's a visual reminder. Visual reminders are always superior to verbal ones. You know, if you say Fridays are game nights, it's not nearly as helpful as just them seeing that in writing on the refrigerator.
That makes sense, yeah. A couple of questions related to busy schedules during the summer. So Joanne says, my husband and I both work full-time, and my ADHD son attends an all-day camp. How do we integrate summer learning? Is it enough to do it on the weekend? And similarly, Sarah says, I have a 13-year-old with ADHD, but I also have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old that need attention, and my husband and I work at different times. How can we fit in work with our 13-year-old on organization skills or other kinds of learning? So these are the challenges that today's families face, right? I mean,
yes, I know. It really is tough. And the one thing that everybody has in common is a bedtime. And so the easiest thing you can do is to tie reading to the bedtime routine. And it may be that the mom who said, I have 3 kids, you know, this is really difficult. It could be that she and the older child read aloud to the younger children, and maybe the mom reads one page, the 13-year-old reads the next page, and then they go back and forth, and the other kids listen. But that might be an easier way of going about it than having 3 kids doing 3 different things, and you just came home from work and you're tired, and that's the last thing you want to do is engage in summer reading. I think that might be a little bit more successful for the week. And then if you say, you know, my weekends are more flexible and I really want my kids to do something on the weekends, that might be a time where maybe if they have an assigned math packet or you want them to practice their math facts, that they can do that on weekends. But think about what is the easiest thing I can do during the week, and it might be reading.
Okay. Are you in favor of setting certain daily goals for reading, 30 minutes, and schedule for reading? What's your advice on integrating reading into the summer?
Mm-hmm. It depends on the age of your child. I think 30 minutes, to be honest, is a long time, especially for an elementary school student. And really, if you have a reluctant reader, you know, I've worked with kids that after a page and a half, they've had it. It really depends on the frustration threshold of your child. So I think starting with a shorter amount of time and seeing how that goes is better than saying 30 minutes just because it's a number you came up with. That may be too much. So maybe start with 20 minutes. That is a better time frame for most kids, and then see how that goes. And it's also a good idea to get your child started and make sure that they're actually doing the reading. So it might be, you know, if they're on chapter 2, say, oh, what's chapter 2 about? I'd love to hear this first page, and have them read it to you or you read it to them. And once you know that they're really reading and they're getting it, then you can say, okay, great, it sounds like you have it. I'm going to be downstairs, you know, doing the dishes or whatever it is that you want to do, checking my email. And then you know your child has gotten started. So I think in general, and even in the school year, when it comes to homework, you do not want to be the homework police, but you do want to get your child started and make sure that they know how to do it before walking away.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's right. That makes sense. Some sort of a fine line between over monitoring versus no monitoring. It sounds like what you're advising. And I've heard that advice before on homework to help them get started. Makes sense. I want to raise the question of video games. This is a perennial issue among the parents, the attitude readers. What do you think about video games during the summer, or in general during the winter, for that matter?
Oh my gosh, it's such a complicated issue.
It is.
You know, if you find that you're constantly battling with your child over video games, it might be that they're better left for evening time. You know, I know a lot of families will say you can have video games after dinner. And the reason is if you let your child, you know, if your child is home alone or you're at home and there's a very unstructured day, or on the weekends, they, you think what they might play it for a half hour, but they're really going to play it for 3 hours. And to them, 3 hours seems like a half hour, and it's really, really hard to get them off of video games. So for a lot of kids, I found that saving them and for later in the evening is a better idea than letting them have video games in the summer, just because it's hard for them to transition away from games. I've had other parents, say for every half hour you read, you can get a half hour of video game time, or for every minute you're working on that math packet, you get a minute of video game time. And if you're an organized parent, that can work too. But I think most of us, keeping track of all that is kind of hard. And so for that reason, I think just having a start time is a good idea.
That makes sense. So at a certain point, you can do video games and for this amount of time, right?
I think so. And in the school year, I do a lot of parent presentations at schools, and that's a common question where parents will say, if you get done with your homework, then you can play video games. And that often backfires because kids, say a sixth grader, the general rule of thumb is that kids should have about 10 minutes of homework per grade level. Certainly with the ADHD, you have to increase that. However, let's say your sixth grader should have about an hour of homework. If they know they can play video games right after, they're probably going to get the homework done in 12 minutes, just to rush through and finish it. And so for that reason, it's better to, not tie that reward to something that you need complete if you're looking for quality as well.
So would the parent say, your homework is from 7 to 8 p.m., regardless of how fast you complete it? And would you start video games at 8 p.m.? And should the parent check the homework, review the homework to see that it's well done?
Sometimes. So let me answer the first question first. Should you have, we call it designated homework time. And the answer is yes, because if you have a student and you're constantly saying, how did you get done with that so quickly? You paid little attention to detail. You're rushing too much. Go back and fix your homework. That never really goes well because they're just, it's very hard for them to check their work and to go back and redo it. So it's much better to remove yourself from that argument and say, look, homework time is from 7 to 8. And if you say you don't have any homework, which usually isn't true, by the way, but if they really, really don't, they can read for pleasure, they can get ahead on a project, but they really need to be sitting for that hour and doing work. And then you can say at 8 o'clock, you can have your video game time. You want to check for completion, I found with kids with ADHD. If you micromanage and make sure that every word is spelled correctly, it really backfires and kids will push away from you very, very quickly. So a better approach is just to say, show me that it's done. Don't judge them if they have misspelled words. I think let it go. Let the teacher manage the quality. The exception to that would be in math, where I really do think you should get them started and make sure they understand it, because if they're doing it the wrong way, the whole page, that's not helpful. So in math, if you see a lot of mistakes, you may want to have them go back and correct those and help them because they may not understand the concept. But in general, I try to leave quality to the teacher for the most part.
That's a helpful distinction. So your job as a parent is to make sure they get started, make sure they've completed it, but not to review the substance of it and check whether it's done correctly or not.
That's correct.
Yeah, that makes sense. In this 1 hour time, is it better to have one solid hour as a parent, or for example, 15-minute breaks with a 5-minute blocks with a 5-minute break?
I would try it out, and you can even talk to your child about it and say, you know what, let's be a detective and figure out what works best for you. Some kids, that hour is a very long time, and they're actually going to get more done if you break it into, say, 20 minutes with a couple-minute break in between. They might be far more productive. Especially, I call these kids Super Bowl kids. You watch the Super Bowl, it's on for 4 hours, but they play the game for an hour. And many of us have kids like that. They should have an hour of homework, but they're, dawdling over it for 3 or 4 hours, and it's taking them forever. And if you have a child like that, those are the kids that work better in chunks of time. So you might set the timer and say, you know what, work for 20 minutes as hard as you can, the best you can, pay attention as much as you can. And then when the timer goes off, you can take a break if you need it, or you can keep on going. And sometimes, once kids get going, they can keep moving along, but they just don't have that initial that oomph to get started in the first place. So a timer can be really helpful to get them started as well.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, those timers are magic, right? I mean, Lily says, my son always has an excuse to avoid reading. What should I do?
I would say that you're probably going to have to get involved and read with him initially. You can also, if he's incredibly resistant to that, then you could consider audible books where he listens and follows along. But again, I would not leave him up in his room and expect that he's really listening and following along to an audible book. You really need to make sure he knows how to do it. And a lot of times kids will listen and they'll start daydreaming and they really won't be listening or paying attention. And that's why having either the Kindle, you're listening and following along, or you actually have the hard copy of the book as well, is really beneficial to kids. So you're probably going to have to get involved in them or help them get started on the audible book at first. But I would go that route. Or have maybe he reads to his little sister, or his older brother reads with him. Or if you feel like as mom or dad, you're in a power struggle with your child, I would try to extricate yourself. And then if you have a spouse or somebody else at home who can take on that role for reading, let them do just the reading, and then you help with other things.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of audiobooks? I've been hearing that they're considered really helpful, and not just for children with dyslexia.
Mm-hmm. Right, not for children with dyslexia. I mean, they're really helpful for anybody, but they're very helpful for kids that have difficulty, that can't always either comprehend the text or they can't decode all of the words, especially if the book is just outside of their reading level, and that's what the research has been done on. And so you can go on Amazon. The audiobooks are actually kind of expensive, so make sure that it's a book that your child will really, really want to read. Make sure you read the summaries with your child, the reviews, to be sure that they're not just going to pick it up and say, oh, I don't like this book after 2 pages, because they can be about $10, $12. And you're going to have to sit with your child and start off with them to make sure they understand how to use audiobooks correctly, or else they could just be listening and daydreaming and really not picking up meaning.
Okay. So sort of sitting with them, listening, and making sure that that everyone's following along on the page.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And and some of the sometimes kids, I've seen this a lot with high school students. They'll take notes or they'll highlight as they go, and then the Kindle has an option to dump all that into a Word document. Ooh. And then that way you have your notes there too. So for kids that have to read, it's not just reading for pleasure, but they have to read for meaning. Maybe they have to report on the book, and it's a complicated book when they go back to school in the fall. That would be an opportunity to take notes as you go. And, anytime reading is dry, the way that you remember what you read is by taking notes as you read. If you're reading for pleasure, you don't have to do that. But if you really have to read for understanding and the text is dry or uninteresting, you have to take notes as you go in order to remember everything.
Makes sense, yeah. Christine asked a question. She says, which is an interesting one, in our school division, we don't receive any sort of assigned work over the summer. Is there any value to buying summer bridging books and workbooks that are available in Barnes & Noble and then asking my child to work through it all summer?
I like the summer bridge books. There's a lot on a page, and there's a lot to do. The text is small, and there's a lot to do on each page. And I found that that's not always a great formula for kids with ADHD. So what I would do is look at them at the bookstore with your child. I wouldn't run out and buy a bunch of things because you could bring them home and your kid wants nothing to do with them. They because they're text heavy, I found that kids kind of avoid them. It might be better to figure out, all right, what does your child really, really need to work on over the summer? For example, I mentioned earlier, a lot of times kids need to develop their automaticity for math facts over the summer. I found it easier to find work that can be done independently by your child and that they're willing to, that they can be successful with. And that's not always the case with the Bridge from 4th to 5th, those books. It's much harder for them to be successful with those books. So let's say your child needs to practice math facts. You can go out and buy just a math facts book and make sure your child does a couple of pages every day, but focuses on one number. For example, they might practice all the sevens tables on Tuesday, and then on Thursday practice all the eights tables, and then on Friday it's the sevens and eights. So anytime you can practice one thing and get really good at it, and then before going on to the next thing, your child is going to be far more successful. And so anytime you can find a measure of success and a way for your student to be independent, it's better than, exposing them to something that is going to be really, really hard for them. That's what you want to avoid over the summer.
Okay, great advice. Wow, yeah. Pamela asks a great question. She says, how can I find a really good tutor near me? Where does one start with that? She happens to be in Western New York, but I think this is a question that anyone listening in might ask.
Mm-hmm. Certainly ask around. Ask your friends. If you have a relationship with the teacher, you can email her if she's on email over the summer. You can call the school to see if they keep a list of tutors, but you can also just do a Google search. And if your child has ADHD, then I would really recommend getting somebody who's also familiar with executive functioning issues. So you could Google things like executive functioning tutoring, educational coaching, anything along those lines, and see what comes up in a Google search. And then call around to a couple of places and ask them about their tutor's experience with students with ADHD.
Okay. What would a tutor in executive function, or someone else's child has impaired working memory, which is a part of executive function, what would a tutor do over the summer to work on executive function and working memory?
Working memory is something that's really, really hard to fix. But certainly you can help students tax their working memory a little bit less. And just for the people out there that they really don't know what working memory is, an easy way to think of it is working memory is the ability to juggle many things in your mind at one time. So, for example, if you say to your child in the middle of winter, okay, go up to your room, get your coat, put on your mittens, and be sure to brush your teeth, it's likely that your child will come down with their mittens, but they haven't brushed their teeth and they don't have their coat, because it's really hard for them to juggle all that in their mind. Working memory also has a lot to do with writing, because you have to think about what you write. So you have to think about, can I get this down on paper? Am I using correct sentence structure? Is my grammar right? Did I spell these words right? What about a period or a comma or an exclamation point? Did I spell my words right? So there's so much you're thinking about that often kids that have working memory issues have a difficult time writing. So think also about the academic impact of the working memory. And if it's writing, or if it's, long division, because there's a lot of steps in that, also have the tutor work with your child on the areas of academic impact, if that makes sense. I think in terms of the other executive functioning issues, like planning is a big one. Procrastination is a huge one a lot of our kids deal with. Tutor help them to plan their, one thing my son's coach did with him, which I love, is she had him plan out his whole summer. All right, what weeks do you have camp? where when you're going on vacation, what are even the weeks he has camp? All right, let's put together a list of things that you're going to need for this camp. So even though it wasn't really academic, she helped him to think ahead and to think about how he prepares a list. And I found that has been very helpful to him, and it's kind of taken the stress out of me having to manage that process as well. But it's also been helpful because she's helped him figure out what he has to have done by the end of the summer and backwards plan that too. So those are all things somebody could do.
Yeah. Yeah, using planning the summer as a way to teach planning seems like a great idea. It's terrific.
And I think what you don't want to do is there's a lot of executive functioning workbooks out there, and what you don't want is somebody to come into your home, work with your child, and be working on skills that are not related to anything and working from a workbook or doing activities that aren't related to your child's daily functioning. That's when kids say, why do I have to do this, Mom?
Right. They can see that it's not relevant. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. One last great question from Stella. She says, my son is starting kindergarten this fall, but is at a first grade reading level. Should we scale back or push forward? Great question.
Oh, I would let your child's interests drive that decision. So I would not ever, scale back. No. Because when you get to kindergarten, a lot of kids, what's normal at that age is incredibly broad. You're going to have kids reading at a fourth grade level. You're going to have kids that don't even know letters. So what's normal is very broad. So I would let interest drive your child. And if your child, really wants to read Magic Treehouse books, then go for it and read them with your child or have her read them independently. Let her sign up for a book club. Let her pick books that she wants to read, but definitely don't scale back.
Okay, so push forward. And thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You're so encouraging, and I feel listening to you that we can all help our children. I'm so grateful for you for your time and for all that you've done in this field. Have a great summer, everyone, and thank you again. And thanks to Brilli for sponsoring the webinar. And we'll see you all, we hope, next week at 1 p.m.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.